What's up guys, welcome to the Chess Giant. This is Solomon Erdell, and in today's video we're covering the Philidor Defense, a very interesting and pretty solid option for black against the move e4, in which we play e5, and against knight f3, defend the pawn on e5 with d6. And I really do feel like the Philidor Defense gets a bad rap, and I'm honestly not sure why. It's a very solid system for black, is very easy to learn, and it's pretty difficult for white to play against. We are guaranteed a pretty solid middle game position as long as we play it correctly. Now really in this position, white has two options: playing d4, breaking through in the center of the board, or playing a more quiet move like bishop c4. These are by far the two most popular options at the master and grandmaster level, so that's what we're going to be covering in today's video. Let's first cover the main line of d4, breaking this game open. Well, against d4 with the Philidor Defense, we're going to take the pawn, and now white again really has two options. White can take with the queen, or white can take with the knight. Let's first go over knight takes d4, in which case we're now going to play knight f6, attacking that e4 pawn, and following knight c3, we're simply going to continue with bishop e7, castling kingside, and rook e8. I mean, really the last four moves we played, knight f6, bishop e7, castling kingside, and then bringing that rook to e8. There's really not much that white can do to stop this. And against a move like f4, with white expanding on the king side of the board, we cannot play passive chess. We can't play moves like knight d7, knight f8, h6. We need to aggressively fight for the center of the board immediately with c5, attacking that knight on d4, getting rid of that centralized minor piece. But when I first saw this move c5, I was wondering, wait a second. I mean, yes, it does get rid of that very strong knight, and it does create some space on the queen side of the board, but it appears as if this pawn on d6 is extremely weak, not to mention this square on d5, which this knight can jump into whenever white would like. However, it actually turns out that following c5, it's nearly impossible for white to really get any kind of momentum against the pawn on d6, and really knight d5 is never an option. We're actually going to tempt white into playing knight d5 the next few moves, and it's actually best for white not to. I mean, here following c5, white needs to move this knight probably to a square like knight b3, and now we just continue with knight c6, naturally developing our pieces, fighting for the dark squares in the center of the board, and I like black's game here. Keep in mind that knight d5, even though this may look good, can't be played because we would simply take that pawn on e4. So here white plays a move like bishop f3, trying to protect the pawn, but now we play bishop f8, and now our rook, which we move to e8 at move 7 in this game, is very active, attacking that pawn on e4. And again, knight d5 can't be played because we would simply take that centralized pawn. If white again defends the pawn on e4, well, now we expand on the queen side of the board with a5, really looking to create some space and play a4, attacking that knight on b3. Honestly, in this position, from a practical standpoint, I really do think it's necessary for white to play a4 and try to lock this game up. But let's just say white plays a move like knight d5, which is very tempting. I mean, playing knight d5, this looks like a very active option, but against this, in addition to simply just taking the knight, we could play a4, kicking this knight back to d2, a very passive square, in which case we can take that knight on d5, continue with knight d4, a very active minor piece attacking the bishop, c2, not to mention our rook on e8, piercing down on e1, and I think that black has a clearly better game here. So again, following this move a5, white really does need to play a4, or we're going to play a4 ourselves, kicking this knight back to d2 and creating a huge attacking momentum on the queen side and the center of the board. So following the move a4, we now see bishop e6, just naturally developing our minor piece and really fighting for the light squares on d5, c4, and attacking that knight on b3. And again, I mean, let's take a look at knight d5. This looks like a very active move, but now we just play c4, attacking the knight on b3. And if a move like knight takes f6, okay, that's fine. We'll simply take the knight back. Following knight d2, which again is forced, we can continue with knight b4. After a move like king h1, play rook a d8. We're going to play d5 here, breaking through in the center of the board. This knight is extremely active, and c3 can't be played because of knight d3 attacking the rook, and f2. Here black again has the huge edge. So again, knight d5, even though this may look like a very aggressive and active move, is actually a big mistake for white. I think better for white is simply playing a move like bishop e3, in which case I personally really like taking the knight on b3. And it actually turns out that in this position, we can play d5, but the theory is very complicated, and honestly, I don't see the rush. I personally like playing queen b6, and then after a move like king h1, playing rook a d8, really trying to get our rooks on e8 and d8 involved. And the very next move, I mean, let's say a move like rook c1 is played, we can now break through with d5. And I know some of you are wondering, at least I was wondering when I first saw this position, how on earth could d5 be considered a good move? I mean, right now we have two defenders, a knight on f6 and a rook on d8, whereas white has 4 attacking pieces. How on earth can this work? Well, it's actually a gambit. We're giving up our pawn, but in return, let's say knight takes d5 is played, we're going to take that knight and then throw our knight into d4. And I mean, just look at the activity of this knight on d4, attacking f3, e2, c2, and b3, as well as our queen on b6, in addition to our rook on e8, piercing down on that dark squared bishop. Honestly, in this position, I think the best move is white just taking that knight on d4, in which case we can play rook takes e1 with check, and then take back with our pawn. And yes, we're currently down a pawn, but in this position, we're putting pressure on that very vulnerable pawn on b3. And once the b3 pawn falls, b2 and a4 are going to be extremely vulnerable to attack. So if a move like queen d1, trying to hold this game together, we can now play rook e8 with the idea of swinging our rook into e3, attacking the b3 pawn even more. Following a move like rook c4, attacking our pass pawn on d4, we can now play the crazy but amazing move, queen takes b3, begging white to take our queen, because if white does, well, we simply have a mate in one with rook e1 checkmate, game over. And if a move like rook takes d4, we could take the pawn on b2, but I personally don't like this because of d6, and this pawn is not far from promotion. I personally like playing bishop d6, making sure that this pawn cannot go anywhere for a very long time, and on top of that, it really locks in this light squared bishop to that pawn on d5, limiting the activity of white's pieces again. Now remember, in this position, our queen can't be taken, and we're currently attacking that pawn on b2, so if a move like rook d2 is played, trying to hold this position together, we can now play the really great move, queen takes a4. Absolutely love this idea. Again, if queen takes a4, thank you for the game with rook e1. And here in this position, I mean, let's just say white plays a move like g3, defending the pawn, which was currently attacked by both our bishop and our queen. We can now play queen b4, and this is not a winning position for black, but I would pick black every single time. I mean, look at the activity of black's pieces. A very strong queen on b4, really putting some pressure on white. A rook on e8, ready to swing into e3, attacking that bishop on b3 with rook b3 and rook takes b2 ideas. We have a bishop on d6, which is really locking down that pawn on d5 and the activity of the bishop on f3. And I would say that black definitely has the edge in this endgame. I would pick, again, black every single time. So going back to this original position, that covers the move knight takes d4. We're simply going to play knight f6, bishop e7, castle kingside, rook e8, continue to play c5, attacking that knight, knight c6, just continue to play very aggressive attacking chess, trying to break through on the queen side in the center of the board, and I absolutely love black's game there. What happens if white takes with the queen? Well, against this, I personally really like the move a6. We could go with the main line of playing knight c6, but against this, white simply plays bishop b5, pinning our knight to our king. I personally like a6, and now we're wanting to play knight c6 without the possibility of bishop b5 being played. I mean, the next move, if we can get knight c6 in, we're simply going to continue with moves like knight f6, bishop e7, bishop g4, attacking that knight on f3. Black's going to have a very easy game there. I think the one move that we really do need to be careful of here is bishop g5. We can't play a move like bishop e7 because of queen takes g7, and we can't play knight f6 because white could simply take that knight and give us double isolated and isolated pawns on the h and f files. I think here we need to play knight c6. The key move, yes, we are giving up our queen, but in return, we get the white queen on d4. And right now, I mean, if this bishop takes our pawn or tries to run away, we're simply going to play knight takes c2, checking both the king and the rook. And now if knight takes d4, we have king takes d8. And in this position, I think the two big differences is that white can castle and black can't. And in addition, white has this pawn on e4 while black has the pawn on d6. But I personally, in this position, don't think that it's a huge deal that black can't castle. I mean, if a move like bishop c4, attacking our pawn on f7, which is, by the way, the most weak pawn in chess, it's actually not weak in this position because we can just play king e8, defending it after a move like knight c3. The key idea of c6, using both our d and c pawns to really try to lock in white's minor pieces, and from here we can continue with moves like g6, fianchettoing our bishop on g7 or h6 even, activating our dark squared bishop, continue to develop our pieces, and I think that black is completely fine in this position. I do want to quickly mention that after the move knight c6, white doesn't have to take our queen. I mean, white could play a move like queen d2, but black has amazing success at the master and grandmaster level in this position. I mean, here, we can simply continue with a move like bishop e7, and if bishop takes e7, play queen takes e7, we're going to continue after a move like knight c3 with a knight f6, continue to bring our bishop to g4, castle kingside, and black has a great game. So that covers the move d4, in which we're simply going to take the pawn against knight takes d4. We're simply going to develop with a knight f6 and naturally develop our pieces. And against queen takes d4, play a6 and knight c6. Now what happens if white plays a more quiet move like bishop c4? Ironically, this is the move that gets a lot of Philidor Defense players in trouble. It attacks that pawn on f7, and knight f6 here is not a bad move, but following knight g5, white has a ton of very dangerous chess traps. I personally like the move order of bishop e7, simply making it so that after knight f6, we can castle right away. This is the easiest move to learn, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Again, I mean, if white breaks through with d4, we're simply going to take and transpose to the variations we just covered. And if castle kingside here, we can now play knight f6. If a move like d3 in Italian game type fashion, we could play a move like knight c6, but I personally really like this c6 setup. Again, using our d and c pawns to really limit the activity of white's minor pieces on the queen side of the board. And on top of that, c6 really does prepare this b5 push. Following a move like rook e1, we can castle kingside, continue with a move like knight bd7, and now if c3 is played, push on the queen side with b5, and following bishop b3, a5. We are really creating a ton of attacking chances on the queen side of the board, and if white tries to slow us down with a move like a4, we can play knight c5, activating our knight, attacking both the light squared bishop on b3 and this pawn on d3. And I think in this position, you're probably going to see a move like bishop c2, in which case we can take the pawn on a4, or just simply continue to develop on the queen side of the board. And against a move like d4, we can now take the bishop on b3, which, by the way, was a very strong minor piece, piercing all the way down to our f7 pawn. Following queen takes b3, we now take control of the diagonal with bishop e6, attacking that queen. And now if a move like queen c2, I think a general rule of thumb for the Philidor defense is when there's ever tension on e5 or b5, do not take the opponent's pawn. Here, if we take this pawn on d4, white is simply going to take back, be attacking our pawn on c6, and have a pretty good edge right in the center of the board. There's really no reason to take this pawn on d4, but instead we should just play queen c7. Keep the tension, and if white ever wants to take our pawn, we are completely fine with that. In fact, we want white to take that pawn because now we can play d takes e5. We have a very active bishop pair aiming down, slicing down on the queen side of the board, a knight on f6 that can eventually come to d7 and c5, really putting pressure on the white camp. And on top of that, we do have a space advantage on the queen side of the board. These rooks, especially the rook on f8, can come to d8, which is a very good file, or even b8, and really try to support this queenside attack. I absolutely love this position for black, and I really do think that whenever white does take that pawn on e5, it's only hurting white because white loses the strong center, while this helps black because it really activates our pieces, gives us some more open files, and we're just playing chess. If you'd like to learn the theory behind the French defense, another strong option for black against e4, click the video to the left. If you'd like to learn the Ponziani opening, a fun and strong chess opening for white, click the video to the right. Leave a comment to let me know what other videos you'd like to see covered on this channel. And as always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.